en Chernigov, en Dnipro, en Kharkov y en Odessa, causando víctimas civiles. Bueno, pues Rusia y Ucrania, sobre todo Rusia, que no se cortan de nada, a pesar de que estamos en un proceso de negociación. Un plan de 28 puntos de Donald Trump, a espaldas de Ucrania, también a espaldas de la Unión Europea, y que ya se ha entregado ese documento y que de momento parece que se está viendo la versión más diplomática de Volodymyr Zelensky, hablando de su disposición de estar listo para negociar este acuerdo. Ya veremos qué es lo que depara cuando hablen en el ámbito privado. Vamos a saludar a Zigor Aldama, experto en geopolítica. Hola, Zigor, buenos días.
Hola, buenos días.
Bueno, en este caso, situación complicada para Zelensky por esos informes de corrupción, pero un plan de 28 puntos en el que lo más significativo es que, bueno, se dice que Ucrania debe estar fuera de la OTAN, pero por otra parte se garantiza su seguridad con la aplicación del artículo 5 de la OTAN.
Bueno, no es exactamente así. Es cierto que se ofrece una garantía que podría ser equiparable, ¿no?, a lo del artículo 5 de la OTAN. De todas formas, hay todavía muchas cosas que no conocemos, que no sabemos cómo se van a negociar. Sabemos cuáles son los 28 puntos ya. Y ayer hablaba con varios ucranianos, algunos de ellos soldados, civiles, consideran que no es aceptable. Y no es aceptable en gran medida por la cesión de todo el Donbass, lo cual supone darle a Putin un territorio que no ha logrado ocupar por la fuerza en los últimos 3 años y medio. Incluso podríamos remontarnos a 12 años, ¿no?, que es cuando anexionó Crimea y comenzaron las hostilidades allí, con lo cual, pues bueno, sí que sería como prácticamente una claudicación, ¿no? También sabemos, por ejemplo, que se reduciría el número de las tropas en el ejército ucraniano a 600.000, lo cual no es la mitad de las que hay ahora, que se estima que son unas 850.000, serían bastantes más de las que tenía en tiempos de paz, que se estiman en unos 250.000, con lo cual, pues ahí sí que había un poco más de garantía de seguridad, porque los ucranianos lo que dicen es que no se fían de los documentos, porque al fin y al cabo, Ucrania y Rusia, ¿no?, ya firmaron el memorándum de Budapest, ¿no?, según el cual Ucrania no sería invadida por Rusia. Eso no ha sucedido. Ucrania dejó las armas nucleares y Rusia terminó invadiendo. En cuanto a el papel de la Unión Europea, vemos que en ese acuerdo de 28 puntos hay un lugar para la firma de la Unión Europea, por lo cual, pues queremos creer, ¿no? Yo creo que es lógico pensar que se consultará con la Unión Europea. Los estadounidenses están diciendo que ya han consultado previamente con Ucrania, concretamente con Umerov, y que por lo tanto no es un acuerdo que se haya hecho completamente a espaldas del gobierno ucraniano, aunque pues ayer fue cuando ese documento se envió oficialmente a Kiev. Hay una cosa que se está mencionando bastante últimamente, en las últimas horas en Ucrania, y es el punto número 26 del acuerdo, por el cual se concede la amnistía a ambas partes, pues de lo que hayan podido hacer en el campo de batalla, ¿no? Con lo cual esto evitaría que haya ningún tipo de reclamación futura para reparaciones o para simplemente procesar e investigar crímenes de guerra, ¿no?, que es algo que los ucranianos, por ejemplo, están haciendo sobre el terreno. Y esto es importante porque, pues al final Ucrania está convencida de que Rusia ha cometido muchísimos crímenes de guerra, de que tiene que pagar además esa reconstrucción, y esto pues lo evitaría. Y si se está diciendo que este documento supondría la victoria o daría la victoria a Rusia, desde luego es una victoria para Estados Unidos, que está haciendo el negocio del siglo. Está vendiendo muchísimas armas, nos está vendiendo el gas natural licuado, y ahora mismo no pondría ni un solo dólar sobre la mesa para la reconstrucción de Ucrania, porque lo que propone es utilizar 100.000 millones de dólares de los fondos o de los activos congelados a Rusia para esa reconstrucción. Otros 100.000 millones los tendría que poner la Unión Europea, y además Estados Unidos se quedaría con el 50% de los beneficios de las empresas que podrían ponerse en marcha de forma conjunta, como por ejemplo el tema de las tierras raras, con lo cual si hay un vencedor aquí y alguien que además tampoco digamos, no se arriesga demasiado, ese yo creo que es Estados Unidos.
¿Y hay algo por lo que pueda pelear Ucrania o la Unión Europea, más allá de las garantías de seguridad? Entiendo que lo más urgente es la cesión de los territorios. Parece que aquí va a haber alguna especie de argucia de respetar el frente, las líneas de febrero de 2022, lo cual supondría en la práctica, bueno, pues la guerra del Donbass para Rusia, la anexión de Crimea 2014 para Rusia. ¿Hay algo por lo que pueda pelear la Unión Europea y Ucrania, Zigor?
Pues yo creo que uno de los puntos en los que posiblemente podría negociar es en el destacamento de tropas extranjeras en suelo ucraniano, que es algo a lo que Moscú se opone. El acuerdo explícitamente dice que los cazas europeos tendrían que estar en Polonia y que no habría una presencia militar extranjera en Ucrania. En el terreno, digamos, de las cesiones territoriales, en su momento Zelensky, no sé si oficial o extraoficialmente, propuso o planteó la posibilidad de que se congelase la línea del frente tal y como estaba en ese momento, que no es muy diferente a tal y como está ahora, ¿no? Con lo cual Ucrania continuaría controlando la parte del Donbass que todavía está en su poder, ¿no? Desde Pokrovsk, que todavía no ha caído, hasta, bueno, pues pasando por Sloviansk o Kramatorsk, que son zonas importantes, y lo que el plan propone es que ahí se cree una zona desmilitarizada, una zona que de facto pertenezca a Rusia, pero en la que no entren las tropas rusas. Digamos que sería un colchón, ¿no?, para dar cierta seguridad a Ucrania de que, bueno, las tropas rusas no se van a acercar tanto para llevar a cabo una posible invasión, ¿no?, una nueva invasión. Me parece que Ucrania tiene difícil negociar estos puntos porque realmente dan, y ha sucedido algo parecido en el plan para Gaza, dan la victoria y ofrecen prácticamente a Moscú todas las exigencias que tenían, ¿no?, cuando arrancaron esta invasión, y además reinstauran al régimen ruso en el terreno geopolítico mundial, porque esa es una de las cosas que se tienen en cuenta en el plan. Y, por ejemplo, incluye volver a invitar a Moscú a que pertenezca al G8, levantar las sanciones, por supuesto, con lo cual, bueno, yo creo que es una victoria. Si esto se firma, que lo dudo, sería una victoria tanto para Putin como para Trump.
Llega en el peor momento para Ucrania y seguramente haya más de un punto sensible en este plan de 28 puntos. Zigor Aldama, experto en geopolítica, muchas gracias. Buen día.
Muchas gracias. Hasta luego.
Y más focos informativos del día, que están en este caso en Frankfurt. La presidenta del Banco Central Europeo, Christine Lagarde, está interviniendo en el Congreso Bancario. Vamos a ver qué mensajes deja sobre la inflación, sobre, quién sabe, la guerra en Ucrania. Adelante, Christine Lagarde.
Does not stand still. In recent years, the global environment has been transformed in ways that none of us could have imagined. We have seen the post-war global order fracturing, the rise of new and some old powers, rapid changes in technology, and an uncertain outlook for global trade and finance. Sounds familiar? It should. Because I'm just quoting myself. And that was here 6 years ago, November 2019. And November 2019 was before the use of AI, or the rise of AI. It had been launched, but ChatGPT was a teeny tiny little thing that nobody really knew about. It was before the re-election of President Trump and his projects. It was before the unjustifiable, brutal invasion of Ukraine. And it was before COVID. And yet. So in that speech, what did I do? Bettina, you're right. I urged Europe to recognize that its old growth model, built on export-led growth, was coming under strain. And I called for a shift to focus instead on developing our domestic economy. And when I use domestic, I talk about Europe. our domestic economy as a source of resilience in an uncertain world. And my point was not, if you remember, to argue for protectionism or inward-looking policies. It was about realism. It was about recognizing that the world was as it is and not as it was. And it was about acknowledging that the solution was already in front of us, and Jean, you alluded to it, the untapped potential of our own internal market. 6 years on, a lot has happened. But the diagnosis that we had back in 2019 has become just clearer, stronger, and more urgent. Europe has become more vulnerable, also due to our blatant dependency on third countries for our security and for the supply of critical raw materials. Global shocks have intensified with rising US tariffs, Russian aggression, and stiffening competition from China, to name a few. And at the same time, during the same period, our domestic internal market has stood still, especially in the areas that will shape future growth: digital technology, artificial intelligence, and in the areas that finance these shaping growth sources, our capital market. And as Galileo said, yet it moves. Europe continues to show resilience, revealing sources of strength that could grow if only we allowed them to do it. So the two questions that I would like to discuss today is, number one, how do we move from being vulnerable yet resilient to being strong? And what will it take to achieve this goal? And I think we have what it takes. And it is not as complicated as we think it is when we bash our head against the walls of complexity in Europe. More on that later. So let's look at the vulnerabilities that you all know about, but I'm going to try to give you some specific examples so that it gives credit to the ECB research and our staff, which is working hard on those issues. So those vulnerabilities stem from having built a growth model around the world that is gradually disappearing under our eyes. We embraced globalization more than anyone else in the world. Well, China probably embraced it a bit more than we did, but in the advanced economy, certainly we were the most advanced. In the 2 decades before the pandemic, external trade as a share of GDP almost doubled in the European Union. It didn't move an inch in the US. And this deep integration brought significant benefits. The number of jobs supported by EU exports rose by 75%, reaching almost 40 million people working for export. And for many years, this was a great source of resilience. But today, that same openness that we celebrated for 2 decades has become a vulnerability. Exports have become a far less reliable engine of growth, reflecting the changing global landscape. Just recently, because we have seen amplification of most phenomena that were in the works for a long time. In mid-2023, for instance, the ECB expected exports to grow by around 8% by mid-2025. You have the same numbers coming out from the WTO. In reality, they have not grown at all. And looking ahead, exports are projected to actually subtract from growth over the next 2 years. This has been felt more acutely in those countries that relied more on that export model and that were active, in particular, in those manufacturing sectors that were export-driven. As a result, growth across the euro area has become more uneven. At the same time, this export-led growth model has resulted in persistent current account surplus, increasing our reliance on other countries to generate our wealth, especially to the United States. Euro area residents hold nearly 10% of their total equity portfolio investment in US stocks, totaling 6.5 trillion. About twice the amount that they held back in 2015. Why? Well, this has been a very rational response by the Europeans, because US markets have delivered returns that were roughly 5 times higher than Europe's returns since 2000. But it has created, as a result, a vicious circle. As US markets channel European savings into high productivity sectors, the performance gap between our economies, Europe and the United States, widens, prompting yet more Europeans to channel their savings across the Atlantic. The result is stagnating productivity at home and growing dependence on others. Finally, we now face a new form of vulnerability, not just us, we share it with others, which is the weaponization of dependencies on key raw materials and technology. Our analysis at the ECB is that 80% of large euro area firms are no more than 3 intermediaries away from a Chinese rare earth supplier. Recent supply shocks, for example, the shortage of automotive chips or the threat of it, have shown how a single choke point can stall entire sectors, the automotive industry notably. Now, these vulnerabilities do not trigger massive, dramatic crisis. Instead, they quietly erode growth as each new shock nudges us into a slightly lower trajectory. And over time, the cumulative effect of this lost growth and lost productivity become material. That's for the vulnerabilities, and we are all saddened by this state of affairs. And yet, as Jean indicated, we are resilient. And I'm going to borrow from him and go a little deeper in some examples, without taking too much time, I hope. Because 2025 has exposed Europe's latent strength. Our experience this year has shown that a resilient domestic economy can shield Europe against global turbulence. And I will mention 3 sources of domestic strength that have helped cushion the shocks that we've suffered. I will quote, just like Jean, people, our potential, and our policies. I have to do that, right? But first, our people. We have benefited from an unusually strong labor market, one that has remained remarkably resilient even as growth has slowed. Typically, employment tends to grow at roughly half the pace of real GDP growth. And yet, since the end of the pandemic, that relationship has been almost, not half, but 1-to-1 in Europe. And this strength has created a virtuous circle. Rising employment, participation has increased as unemployment has reduced, but rising employment has supported consumption, which in turn has sustained services in particular, and created even more jobs, particularly in labor-intensive sectors. And all of that despite an aging phenomenon that is very specific to the advanced economies, but particularly acute in Europe, and immigration, which is a polarizing and dividing phenomenon. People. Second, our potential. Despite the notion that Europe is lagging behind in AI, European firms are moving quickly through the digital transition, and that is making investment more resilient to global uncertainty. And while tangible investment has reduced in the past 2 years, as manufacturing has weakened, intangible investment has risen sharply, keeping overall business investment broadly stable. Firms continue to invest in AI and digital infrastructure because for any company that wants to survive, this is just not optional. People, potential, policies. Fiscal policy, in particular, has acted counter-cyclically, buffering the economy rather than amplifying downturns, as happened after the financial crisis. The fiscal packages now being implemented for defense and infrastructure, especially here in Germany, are coming at the right time for Europe and will have a measurable effect on growth. It has to be done and implemented. ECB staff estimate that higher government investment between now and 27, so over 2 years, will offset around 1/3 of the trade shock that we are suffering. Keep that number in mind, 1/3, because I'll come back to it later. Monetary policy. The ECB is also playing its part by delivering price stability. A few years back, we were talking a lot more about inflation and interest rates. I haven't heard anything yet. We have cut interest rates by 200 basis points from their peak, and this is increasingly feeding through into easier financing conditions, which is helpful to support demand. We will continue to adjust our policy as needed to ensure that inflation remains at our target. So together, these three sources of resilience will help anchor growth at home. Domestic demand is set to become.
La presidenta del Banco Central Europeo advirtiendo muchos riesgos sobre la inteligencia artificial, sobre las tierras raras y cómo puede perjudicar a la cadena de suministro de la industria automotriz, y reconociendo que Europa es vulnerable por su dependencia de terceros. Una Christine Lagarde que ha reiterado la postura del Banco Central Europeo de mantener sin cambios ya por 3 reuniones consecutivas los tipos de interés, actualmente en ese rango del 2%, de momento guardándose alguna bala en la recámara ante posibles disrupciones en la cadena de suministros o el impacto potencial de los aranceles de Donald Trump, sin descartar efectos de segunda ronda en la inflación, que de momento está bastante contenida, con algunas de las principales economías de la zona euro, como Francia, como Italia, por debajo de ese 2% que se fija como objetivo el Banco Central Europeo. Una Christine Lagarde que, bueno, ha dicho que incluso hace 6 años ya advirtió a la Unión Europea sobre su modelo de crecimiento anticuado, como lo oyen. Dice que ya advirtió a las autoridades europeas que algo había que cambiar, porque en la mano del Banco Central Europeo está el mandato de la estabilización de precios y también las decisiones de política monetaria. Una Christine Lagarde que también advertía que la apertura de nuestra fortaleza durante 2 décadas, dice, se ha convertido en una vulnerabilidad. Ya no se salva ni la pujante industria aeronáutica ni la sólida industria automotriz, porque ahora hay muchos jugadores, y habla incluso de un solo punto. Dice un solo punto de estrangulamiento puede paralizar la industria automotriz, en una clara, parece, alusión a las tierras raras. Vamos a seguir escuchando a Christine Lagarde.
Exposes how much potential Europe continues to leave untapped. Today, despite more than 30 years of the single market, intra-EU trade barriers in key areas remain too high. So you might remember the analysis that was conducted by the IMF about 2 years ago that indicated that services were prevented from circulating within the single market, and that was the equivalent of about 110% of tariffs, and the same for goods, about 40% of tariffs. And everybody at the time said, oh, this is a questionable piece of research. So I asked my teams at the ECB to just go a little deeper into it to see whether it was questionable or not questionable, because I was quoting those numbers from my previous place. Well, they did thorough work on this, and the analysis that they produced is that internal barriers in services and goods markets are equivalent to tariff of around 100% for services, so slightly less than the IMF research, and 65% for goods, a little more than the 40% of the IMF. This is what we produce and that we inflict on ourselves. Now, let's be realistic again. We should not expect those barriers to disappear all of a sudden. Why is that? Because not all products are equally tradable, because not all professions are the same, and because national and cultural preferences will continue to play a role in Europe, because Europe is based on diversity. Policy can reduce certain frictions. It's not going to eliminate them entirely. But we should expect at least 2 things. First, that barriers are low enough for the sectors that will shape future growth to operate in a truly European market. And this is clearly not the case, in particular for digital services, which will drive future innovation. And this is certainly not yet the case for capital markets, which must finance it. The second expectation that we should have is that being inside the single market, part of the club, offers a clear advantage over being outside the single market. In other words, that internal barriers are lower than external ones. But this is also not currently the case for services. Barriers to cross-border trade within Europe have been declining just as much as the barriers to operating from outside into Europe. So this helps explain why, even though services now account for 3/4 of Europe's economy, intra-EU trade in services makes up only about 1/6 of our GDP, which is roughly the same as our trade in services with the rest of the world. There is no competitive advantage to actually providing services within Europe. So this is a colossal waste of potential, especially at a time when we must rely more on ourselves than on others. And the key point is that achieving these gains does not require radical changes. I know exactly what some of you think. Oh, it's going to require treaty change. It's going to require massive political push. You might be right on the latter, not right on the first. Our analysis shows that if all EU countries were to lower their internal barriers only to the level of that of the Netherlands, internal barriers could fall by about 8 percentage points for goods and 9 percentage points for services. I don't pretend that the Netherlands is the panacea for everything, but their barriers are significantly lower than most of the other EU members. So remember, 8% for goods, 9% for services. And if we were to only do 1/4 of that, that would be enough to boost internal trade enough to fully, not 1/3. Remember what I said about the investment over 2 years in military and infrastructure that would offset 1/3 of the trade impact that we're suffering as a result of tariffs? That, only 1/4, would offset the entire consequences of the tariff shocks that we are suffering. So the real question, and that's really getting to the beef of the matter, is why are we not taking those steps? And I'm going to point to one particular area. Others might argue that it requires a cultural shift, that it requires a political mega change. I'm just going to focus on 3 governance avenues that are available and that should be used. So the first one that I will use is harmonization of national law and regulations. We should understand that this is neither realistic nor even necessary. But we need the tools to go in that direction without reshuffling everything or without treaty change. And the first one that I would mention is to revive the principle of mutual recognition. It was the very engine of liberalization that powered the single market in the 1980s. What is mutual recognition? Well, it means very simply that if a product or a service or a profession is lawfully provided or practiced in one member state, it should be allowed to circulate freely across the European Union without the need to comply again with every other country's rule. If we look at financial services, today, banks already benefit from a passporting system, which means that a single license granted by the ECB enables them to provide services across Europe. But they will face different rules in foundational elements of the framework they operate in. And we have to appreciate that completing the banking union, deepening our capital market, and there are really good proposals coming out of the Commission that will be, I think, disclosed formally in early December. Deepening that capital market, harmonizing supervision would therefore be transformative, accelerating the path towards a truly integrated home market. The same logic applies to digital economy. Just as passporting embodies mutual recognition, the mutual recognition of digital identities trust, services, and other credentials would dramatically improve interoperability and eliminate hidden costs that slow the growth of Europe's digital markets. So that's step number one, mutual recognition, taken one level higher, not just the recognition of professions around Europe, but going deeper into what is the backbone of the economies of the future that will drive our growth. The second step, and I'm taking you a little bit further into the difficulty of it, is to streamline the decision-making. By doing what? By extending qualified majority voting to areas on which Europe's future growth depends. Qualified majority voting has always existed within a certain perimeter, and it's been instrumental in driving integration, but it has now reached the limit of this perimeter. In several critical fields, the continued requirements for unanimity in the European Council still prevent meaningful progress towards completing the single market. What comes to mind? Taxation. Taxation is a clear example. You know, I've been sharing those meetings of finance minister when we try to move forward into some degree of harmonization of either the corporate tax base or the VAT. Well, reforms such as harmonizing VAT rules or establishing this consolidated corporate tax basis remain stuck because of national vetoes. Not so many of them, but national vetoes, one is enough, leaving firms to navigate a maze of fragmented tax regimes. That fragmentation is particularly damageable in a world of digital business models, which rely predominantly on intangible assets. Because clearly, national tax policies are pretty important to actually help out in respect of those entities and those elements of value. I'll give you an example. If a digital platform provides cloud or software services across Europe, it must currently comply with 27 different VAT systems, each with its own definition of where value is created for tax purposes. Now, I'm a former lawyer. I was in private practice for 25 years. This is a minefield for tax lawyers. They love it. But it's an expensive business to run. And as a result of that, it favors those that can afford the assessment of the 27 different regimes, and as a result, the tailoring of the products that they sell. The large one can absorb the cost. The small, medium-sized companies, not necessarily. And this is exactly not what Europe should want if it wants to nurture its own digital industry. Much talk about the European cloud, and I'm delighted to see that there are joint ventures now being blessed between France and Europe in that and Germany in that respect, but there are major obstacles. So moving to qualified majority voting using what is called the passerelle clause where necessary, which allows the European Council to shift specific areas from unanimity to majority voting without changing the treaties, could actually help break this deadlock. And to break the deadlock, you actually need unanimity, but to get that is a matter of trade-off between the member states. And it has been achieved in the past and it can be achieved again. The third step, and this is my final one, is to take a more radical approach to simplification. And I do not mean trimming regulations through more omnibus proposals. And I'm delighted that those omnibus proposals are on the table and that there is movement in that respect. But the fastest way to achieve genuine simplification is not by repealing existing rules, which is an excruciating process, but, as advocated by Jean as well, by creating this 28th regime, which now finally the Commission really rallies behind. What are those 28 regimes? It's not, fantasy land. It exists. There are 28 regimes. Those are optional EU legal frameworks that sit alongside rather than replace national law. They coexist. They actually compete, for that matter. These frameworks would allow firms to opt into a single European rulebook in specific areas. As Jean mentioned, single rulebook has moved forward, and certainly the needle has changed direction as a result. Prime candidate for that, obviously company law. And that is proposed in the Letta and Draghi report, both. A European company law regime would provide firms, in particular startups and scale-ups, but I contend not necessarily only startups and scale-ups, because I fear that we're going to see yet again the sort of complexity of Europe good intentions landing in how many employees, how much turnover, how many implantations here and where and whatever. Why not just be as simple as possible and let it open to any of those who want to opt for the single, the special regime, the 28th regime? And as I said, this approach has worked before. There are 28 regimes. I'll mention two of them. The EU trademark from 1993, the community design, 2001, were both 28th regime offering optional EU-wide intellectual property title alongside with national laws. And both have been widely adopted, especially by firms active across multiple markets. That success shows how an optional EU framework can reduce fragmentation and even, as I said, generate some healthy competition between the systems.